We need these signals that there is innovation happening on the ground.
So let's start by getting rid of the harmful fossil fuel subsidies in agriculture.
The fossil fuel industry needs to start paying for it.
Welcome everybody to episode 7 of our popular Dino Talks. This is a series brought to you by the UN Development Programme and We Don't Have Time. And we're trying to illuminate all the different ways in which fossil fuel subsidies by governments and also the damage caused by fossil fuels that are subsidised are doing to our economies. We're concerned about the level playing field between innovation and change and decarbonisation and the slow drag that fossil fuel subsidies have on all these opportunities for delivering a better, safer world, not least from climate change. In previous episodes, we've looked at things like what are fossil fuel subsidies, how big are they, and also how governments have been struggling to actually get themselves off fossil fuel subsidies. We've also looked at plastics, for example, and how they are actually based on fossil fuel that is subsidized and actually affects the balance between whether we recycle, reuse and create a circular economy of plastics, or whether companies and consumers are continuing to buy virgin plastic made from fossil fuels. Today, we're going to have a quick look at agriculture and our food systems. We know that farmers need fertilizers. They contain nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and potash, or what's known as potassium. The question is, where do they come from? If you're an organic farmer, then maybe you use manure or compost, but most farmers are using fertilizers that are made from fossil fuels or from mines in often remote or politically sensitive parts of the globe. The production of fertilizers is energy intensive, either in the processing of the fossil fuels to create nitrogen compounds or in the digging up of phosphorus and potassium. There's also a great deal of fossil fuels, subsidized fossil fuels, involved in the transportation to and from chemical plants and mines. The question here is twofold. If the fossil fuels behind the production of these products are subsidized and thus cheaper than they might otherwise be, what does it mean in respect to issues like climate change and innovative, potentially cost-effective alternatives? We know that agriculture is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, including nitrogen compounds linked with fertilizer use. Could other forms of agriculture be less damaging and more widespread if the price signal was different? Think regenerative agriculture. It's sometimes hard to say that, isn't it? Which tends to work with nature rather than against it. And think, do fossil fuel subsidies work against the recycling of waste fertilizers by making reuse seem or be more expensive? Amazingly, and this is what we're going to find out as well, there are massive amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus and potash produced in the past that are now in our waste streams, going to landfills and therefore being lost, or pouring through our water treatment works and lost down rivers and out to the sea. Could we harvest them rather than wasting them and bring them back into agriculture and economic usefulness, and in doing so, help with food security and climate change by reducing the demand for new fertilizers based on fossil fuels and faraway mining operations? In other words, could we make our economies and our agriculture more efficient, less polluting, and more careful of scarce resources if fossil fuel subsidies were managed down and innovation, creativity, and new ideas and approaches are given a better chance to compete and succeed? Finally, let me add a couple of housekeeping things. Our numbers on fossil fuel subsidies that we're using on these shows come from the International Monetary Fund, and they have direct subsidies of roughly around about $580 billion. That's paying fossil fuel companies and also consumers to keep fossil fuels artificially cheap. And then there are the externalities, the indirect subsidies, you might like to say, which is how our economy is, in a sense, subsidizing the damage caused by fossil fuels. Think air pollution, think climate impacts, storms, extreme weather events, and so on. Finally, I want to thank Prime Computer, who is supporting this series. They're a partner with We Don't Have Time. And can I ask the viewers to download the We Don't Have Time app at wedon'thavetime.org. And then you can ask questions of the guests and you can interact with the We Don't Have Time family.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
Okay, fossil fuel subsidies in agriculture. It's a really complex topic, but we've got two fantastic guests and my co-host Cassie Flynn from UNDP to have a go at this. Let me introduce our first guest. It's Steve Trent. He's CEO and founder of the Environmental Justice Foundation based in the United Kingdom. Steve has over 30 years experience in environmental and human rights campaigning, as well as leading investigations in over 40 countries. Steve also co-founded WildAid, serving as a president for over a decade and leading that NGO's work in China and India. Prior to this, Steve was campaigns director at the Environmental Investigation Agency. And I've also read your website, Steve, where you talk about fossil fuel subsidies and, of course, agricultural subsidies as well. Steve, I'm going to give you the floor. Give us your perspective on how fossil fuel subsidies come somehow into this agricultural story. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Nick and Cassie, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are to all of those joining us. So this is, as you said, a potentially huge subject, and we could discuss it all day. So I have to simplify and talk to the headlines, if you like. What I'd like to do is start by setting the scene. So in 2020, global fossil fuel subsidies were around $5.9 trillion, or 6.8% of global GDP. And these fossil fuel subsidies touch almost every aspect of our lives. They permeate supply chains for countless products and the systems which support the way billions of us live, not least across the modern system of industrial agriculture, which now feeds the vast bulk of people on our planet. Globally, I think it's important for everyone listening to know the public, that's you, are providing more than $1 million every minute in farm subsidies, much of which is for carbon-intensive activities that guzzle fossil fuels and that are driving the climate crisis. So how did we get to this point? Well, during the second half of the 20th century, unprecedented growth in global crop production, fueled in part by the recent availability of fertilizers, occurred side by side with dramatic and an unprecedented population growth, going from 2.4 billion in 1945 to 7.3 billion in 2015, with estimates suggesting that around 9.6 billion of us will be on this small planet by 2050. And everybody needs to be fed. Global crop production at the same time has more than tripled over the last 50 years or so, alongside a broadly corresponding increase in the consumption of animal products and other resource-intensive foods. And to give you just some idea of the scale that this operates at, consider this. In 2021, just one company processed 26.8 million cattle, 46.7 million pigs, and an astonishing 4.9 billion chickens. This same company has increased its carbon footprint by 51% in 5 years, and alone produces as much carbon dioxide as Italy. Globally, dairy and meat production are anticipated to increase even further by 65% and 76% respectively by 2050. And today, just 4% of the world's mammals by weight are wild, with humans accounting for 36% and livestock the remaining 60%. At the same time, just 5 countries, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and the United States, produce more than half the world's crops. And just 4 crops, wheat, rice, maize, and soybeans, constitute more than 1/2 of all the current food production on land. Croplands and rangelands now cover approximately 38% of the planet's ice-free land surface. Now, many of these changes have been driven by 3 key factors, and I'm talking headlines here. The rapid globalization of food production and supply systems, most of it reliant on fossil fuels, the decoupling of crop and animal-based agriculture, and the increasing availability of fertilizers, and in particular, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, almost all of which are carbon intensive, needing vast amount of fossil fuels for their production, distribution, and use. Now, while it is undeniably true that these changes have been able to feed more people, it's equally true that they are having a devastating impact on our ecological security across the world. And many argue, and with hard facts and good reason, that farming is the world's greatest cause of habitat destruction, the single greatest cause of global loss of wildlife and species extinctions, and it is responsible for around 80% of deforestation. Indeed, UNDP published a report last year that suggested 87% of the eye-watering $700 billion of annual government support for agricultural producers includes both measures that are price distorting and those that can be harmful to nature and health, including supporting practices that have high greenhouse gas emissions. Conversely, just 1% of this $700 billion is given to benefit the environment. Now, that's the background. And at this point, I want to quickly highlight a particular issue that illustrates well the negative impacts of fossil fuel subsidies in agriculture. Recent research by Greenpeace, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and the organisation GRAIN shows that synthetic nitrogen-based fertilizers are a major driver of the climate crisis, responsible for 1 out of every 40 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions that are currently pumped into the atmosphere. The full synthetic nitrogen fertilizer supply chain was responsible for an estimated volume of around 1,250 million tonnes of carbon dioxide in 2018. And for comparison, emissions from commercial aviation in the same year were around 900 million tonnes of CO2. And these are precisely the type of chemical fertilizers that are being paid for by agricultural subsidies. One other fact that I think is important, the majority of the emissions from these synthetic nitrogen fertilizers occur after they are applied to the soil, entering the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, a persistent greenhouse gas, with 265 times more global warming potential than carbon dioxide. And that brings me to my central point today, perhaps. We must recognise now and act on the knowledge that humanity is in a historical moment which The capacity to live without irreversibly compromising the environmental and biophysical conditions on which we depend is fundamentally at question. Put simply, the security of humanity is at risk without reform to these subsidies. And paramount in this will be a switch from the carbon-intensive activities that are contributing so substantially to global heating to those that can help carbon storage, such as restoring soils through different agricultural practices and the production of healthier food. Indeed, one recent study, which modelled the US agricultural system without farmed animals, found that without animal food production, the overall food production of the USA would increase by 23%, and at the same time decrease costs. Indeed, so many experts question the whole notion that subsidies are needed to supply cheap food at all. Some suggest that the cost of the damage caused by industrial agriculture is greater than the value of the food produced, and note that more environmentally focused farming can actually cut food prices just as it improves the land. We need to redeploy these subsidies to support agriculture that does not at the same time undermine and erode the very systems that make food production possible. So my closing point, all too often action to create sustainable systems, and none are more important than our food production system, is presented as a cost, when in reality effective action now to combat the existential climate crisis will be the biggest cost saving in human history. We are borrowing now against the bank of nature, and the interest rates are wholly unsustainable and increasing day by day. So now is the time to pay our debt, reorganise our systems, and create a sustainable, equitable and survivable future for humanity. So let's start by getting rid of the harmful fossil fuel subsidies in agriculture.
Great, Steve. Well, that was a fantastic race through the topics, and thank you for your perspective on this thing. Let's turn to our second guest now. Sara Sternstrom is project manager at EasyMining in Sweden, and they're a very innovative company. Their mining doesn't mean getting out big drilling machines and demolishing whole mountains and other things. They're actually doing something far more interesting than that. The company is at the cutting edge of the circular economy. They're developing a range of innovations to bring resources back from waste streams into economic use, including those crucial to agriculture and food production. EasyMining, which is part of a company called Rag & Cells, is trying to avoid precious, often limited resources and materials going to landfills, reducing environmental damage, and cutting dependency on virgin, often mined materials that come from far away and have a heavy carbon footprint, not least in the long supply and transport chains. So, and we say a heavy footprint, many of those transportation systems, of course, use subsidized fossil fuels, as well as the fertilizers using methane to make the fertilizers in the first place. Okay, Sara, I'm going to give you the floor. Tell us what clever things you're doing, and yeah, then we'll get into the fossil fuel side of this, subsidy side. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I will do my best to explain what we are doing and what the potentials are. So today, almost half of our climate impact and 90% of water scarcity issues are linked to the way we extract resources and produce goods and food. Extraction and processing of virgin resources is, of course, very heavily based on fossil fuels. And if we are being serious about transitioning to a sustainable society, we really need to start using the materials we already have over and over again. And nutrients here is a really good example. Phosphorus and nitrogen are key macronutrients. Without them, global agriculture output would be cut into half. Wastewater from households and industries contain massive amounts of both phosphorus and nitrogen, but today, this is a problem rather than an asset. Wastewater treatment plants put great efforts into discharging the sludge, even though this sludge is rich in phosphorus, and nitrogen is released from the plant as nitrous oxide, which has a huge climate impact. So phosphorus is really important. So with different approaches, the opportunities are enormous, I would say. Phosphorus is listed by the EU as a critical raw material. And it can be recovered from sludge and brought back into the loop, and that would secure endless of supply. So today, EU is largely, like 92%, dependent on import of phosphorus, as most mines are located outside Europe. And until recently, the main source in the Nordics has been Russia, for example. About 80% of the world's known reserves are actually in the hands of one country, which is Morocco. So because of this limited availability of this scarce resource, the large ecological footprint from mining, geopolitical instability in the sourcing countries, long transports, and health issues from the contamination of cadmium in several of these mines, safe recycling of phosphorus should be a top priority. EasyMining has developed a process called ash to phos. Here we create circular economy for real. This process uses ash from incinerated sewage sludge to recovered phosphorus, bringing back a pure recycled phosphorus that can be used either in fertilizers or in feed. And then we have nitrogen. Nitrogen can be captured from wastewater streams and used to produce fertilizers, replacing today's greenhouse gas heavily production, which is dependent also on natural gas supply. So in this way, the wastewater treatment plants of today will be tomorrow's resource plants. This will, of course, require that we do alternations in legislations, both nationally and internationally. And a key factor will, of course, be to create a fair level of playing field. The fossil fuel industry needs to start paying for their climate impact, not to be allowed to push costs to society and to future generations. So my take-home message today is that making the wastewater treatment plants, resource plants, is well within reach. We have plenty of phosphorus and nitrogen right here in our sewers. We just have to start using it.
Thanks, Sara. It's fascinating because, you know, most when we talk about environmental issues and things like that and climate change, we often don't drill down into this kind of innovation that's going on around us. People aren't even aware that in the wastewater systems and in the stuff that goes into landfill, that it's rich with all these things that are currently produced from virgin fossil fuels with a subsidy, or from mining operations with long transport systems, the mines using a lot of energy, and then the transportation using a lot of energy, or subsidized. Whereas tons of this stuff is actually just on our back doorstep, if only we're smart enough to actually get it out of our waste flows. Let me introduce Cassie Flynn here, who is my wonderful co-host and a patient co-host. She is UNDP's strategic advisor on climate change, and she's head of the Climate Promise. She's an internationally recognized expert on global treaty negotiations on climate change. She advises many countries on how to develop their plans to fulfill the Paris Climate Agreement. And she's advised the Prime Minister of Fiji, for example, when the UN Climate Conference was held in Bonn in 2017. And she was named the 13th most influential person on climate change in 2017 by Analytica, which it just really irritates me because I've never been named like anything as being influential for nothing, you know?
You influence us all, Nick. You influence us all.
That's the burden of being a comms director. Everyone thinks you're invisible. Anyway, Cassie, give us a little sum up of what you've heard from our wonderful guests, because two very different perspectives there. One, the kind of, this is the big global kind of thing, what's going on with agriculture. And then Sara with a very interesting story of innovation, which would be probably be more fast forwarded in a sense if we didn't have fossil fuel subsidies giving an artificial price to the virgin stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly, I'm going to pick up where you leave off here, Nick, is that it is really striking sort of hearing from both Steve and Sara, because, Steve, listening to you about this big picture problem that we have. And even, you put it so beautifully and so simply, is that we have, population increases, everyone needs food. There's not a person on the planet that doesn't need food. And how do we create a system that can meet this level of demand, meet it in an equitable and fair way, but also meet it in a clean way? Because agriculture is not a free system. It's not that we plant crops, we grow crops, we eat them, and then we dispose, and then everything is happy. We have an intricate level of systems and companies and interests and politics in these systems that have shaped how people have access to food and at what levels. And it was so striking when you were talking about the 5 countries that are a majority of our food systems, the 5 crops that are a majority of our food systems. We have centralized our systems in a way that is very precarious, and puts us in a very vulnerable position when we start talking about climate change. And I think, Sara, this is exactly where I think we needed to hear from you. We need these signs of hope. We need these signals that there is innovation happening on the ground, and that in these systems, we can start to break them apart. We can start to say, all right, well, we don't have to assume that our fertilizer is going to look and be created in a certain way, that we can actually start to innovate and start to think about, well, how can we create a circular economy in a way that is smart and reduce costs and keeps this idea of fossil fuel subsidies off the table, because quite frankly, we don't need them. We don't need them because we've built a system that doesn't need them. So really looking forward to diving further into this, Nick. You set it up so beautifully in the beginning about, where do all these things come from, and how can we start to unpack this complicated issue? So Nick, back over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd just like to say one thing before I go on this, because we'll have people watching this show, many hundreds of thousands of people, and some of them will say, oh, this is all cloud cuckoo land, blah, 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 blah. But, of course, when we look at renewable energy, for example, I remember being a journalist on the Times newspaper in London in the 1990s, writing about wind power and solar power, and it was like $50 a unit of electricity. Everybody laughed, and the British government even got rid of its renewable energy investments in research and development, saying this will never be an option, right? And of course, now we know what's happened to renewable energy. It's a remarkable story, and it's cheaper than coal and often other fossil fuels. So we need innovation, creativity, and we need to shorten the distance between the ideas and the implementation to create a diversity of solutions to what we're facing. Cassie, maybe you could come in here with this question, because we are living through difficult times right now. Yeah, maybe you could frame that question in the respect to what's happening with food prices and the war. Yeah.
Right. I think this issue of agriculture and this issue of fertilizers has now, we've seen in all these headlines when we're talking about the war in Ukraine. And I think it has ignited a really important discussion about some of these issues that exactly Steve and Sara are talking about. And so, Steve and Sara, I would love to hear from you, just sort of your opinions about how do we start to level this playing field? If we know that fossil fuel subsidies are causing the inefficient use of fertilizers, and that this system is kind of upside down in many ways, how do we create this playing field? And how do we address hunger? How do we ensure that our supply chains are clean and green when it comes to food supplies and food security around the world? And also being able to put in place this infrastructure and these systems so that we can do this not just now in the response to this horrific crisis, but also in the long term. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe Steve, we can start with you.
Sure. Well, I come to this from a very simple point in that, I've seen people around the world that are hungry, and I understand that hunger has a human face. And we need to address this in a smart way to address those very real problems that are with us now. Several things that I would say that we can do. First is think smarter, think better, and don't just accept the received wisdom. So in my brief presentation, I spoke about redirecting, redeploying these subsidies away from harmful practices and fossil fuels through to better, more sustainable, to use a simple phrase, agricultural practices. And the key point here is there are a growing number of studies that can demonstrate this doesn't mean a decline in productivity. It doesn't mean a decline in standards or the availability of food. It can mean quite the opposite. We do need to look at our dietary choices. We do need to look at the food that we consume, particularly in the developed world. But I think these are small prices to pay for the overarching benefit of reinforcing sustainable agriculture and global food security. And if I could just say one other very quick point about this, roughly, give or take, 25% of food production is lost, thrown away, or wasted in one way or another. Now, in the developing world, the percentage that is lost at the stage of retail or consumer is relatively small. Most of it is lost because of environmental problems, pests, floods, droughts, things like that. But in the developed world, we are literally just throwing our food away. And again, smart systems, both of distribution and education to educate consumers and retailers about how to use food better, could at a stroke help solve some of the problems of both price and hunger. So I think there are solutions, and this is the key point I want to make. It's very easy to articulate the doomsday scenario, but the much more valuable and interesting point is, where are these solutions? Like Sara is saying with her company, drilling down into this, getting smart and looking at it in a way that transforms what we're currently doing now into something much better.
So any thoughts on this? I mean, one of the challenges you face, of course, is that you're doing a novel process which is demonstrating that you can bring these fertilizers that are literally, under our feet or when we're paddling in the water with our toes, it's there as well in the river. But sometimes legislation's a bit slow, isn't it, catching up with innovation? Is that a challenge for some of the things you're doing?
Yes, I mean, if you want to make a change, if you're being serious with transitioning to sustainable society and reusing things over and over again, it will, in this case, definitely start with legislation that needs to change. And I think that we see now that there are a lot of legislations that being transformed a bit from linear to circular. We still have a lot of things to do. But two key legislations that we need to change now is the Sewage Sludge Directive, which is super old, and we need to have also the Wastewater Treatment Directive in place. And these guys needs to push for recovery of nutrients, and also that we have pure things putting on agriculture so that we do not loop back any contaminants. So I would say high amounts of nutrients being recovered in these legislations, but also that they are clean. We have clean products, so we don't put depth to the future generations.
Let me go with one quick question, Sara, and then I think we might come to wrap up here and give Cassie the final word in the question area. You sent me, and this is why I think we need to put this in context, because some people think what Sara's talking about might be just a small thing that would be a pinprick on this issue of, do we use fertilizers subsidized by fossil fuels and therefore create double problems of inefficiency as well, of course, in agriculture? Or can we actually really bring significant numbers of these materials we need for agriculture back? And so I'm going to ask you, Sara, about, just how much phosphorus, for example, could we bring back in Europe if we adopted a system that you're suggesting, like a circular system this way?
Yeah, we can have a theoretical example. So based on the assumption that the European sewage sludge contains about 300,000 tons of phosphorus produced every year, if we use our ash to phos technology on all sewage sludge, we could bring back around 270,000 tons of phosphorus each year. So this compares to around about 25% of the phosphorus demand in mineral fertilizers in Europe today. So I think that's kind of a great number. And this is only the sewage sludge. Of course, there are other sources where you can extract phosphorus and bring it back.
Yeah. So in other words, you wouldn't have to rely on these heavy fossil fuel intensive mining operations to get the phosphorus and then transport it over large distances using often fossil fuels, either in ships or in trucks. Of course, Scania has electrified trucks, they're different, but you know what I mean? So, I mean, these are the kinds of stories we should be telling around the world to make people see that there is an opportunity to change and to be more intelligent about how we manage waste, that waste isn't a thing, should be no longer a thing, it should be a resource wherever it is, rather than something that we just landfill or get rid of. Cassie, we're running out of time, but maybe you can give us one last question. It's the fairy godmother question.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I love this question because when we're thinking about the scale of fossil fuel subsidies, it is so massive. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Nick, we talked about 580 billion. And
indirect subsidies, 580
indirect,
not including the indirect subsidies, yeah.
Not include the indirect, which are in the trillions, as Steve told us, 5.9 trillion. Which at the end of the day, we are talking a lot of money. And so, Steve and Sara, I'm really interested about what would you do if you could be the fairy godmother, if you could be the benevolent wizard, and you could wave your wand and provide new things to do with this huge amount of money, what would you do?
Well, it's a great question. It's a fantastic question, that one.
We're not talking putting bets on the horses, Steve. Yeah. We're not talking putting bets on the horses, right? Something useful, yeah.
So many things I think I would do. I'm going to pick up on my previous statements. I think immediately use some of that money to address food waste and really drive down on that. So we get rid of the wasteful systems that we've got. I would look at other systems that relate to the delivery of much more sensitive and sustainable agriculture, promoting things like organic, but not just organic. Public education in all of this is so key. We have to win hearts and minds. Unless we take people with this, I think all the legislation in the world is not going to do it. It's not going to cut through. So let's educate people. Let's look at new systems. And last point, because I've got so much money to spend, you've offered me. I think the research and development into new systems like those that Sara is telling us about, new methods of production, developing them quickly and learning from nature. Very last point, in nature there is no waste. Everything is food for something else. Everything is sustaining something else. Look at those systems, learn from them, and let's apply them to our livable world, and it will make a big difference.
Sara?
Yeah, I guess my answer is a bit shorter, and of course we could speed up building plants and have domestic production of clean, recycled nutrients in many countries. This is, of course, a solution. The solutions, we have several solutions that could be used globally. So I guess we could save a lot of mining. And the other thing is, yeah, of course, education, as you say, super important. And the last thing, we can, of course, increase and do more research and come up with even more solutions, innovations.
Yeah. Brilliant. So good. Thank you very much indeed to our lovely guests, Steve and Sara and Steve, and to Cassie Flynn, my co-moderator, or I'm her co-moderator, however you want to put it. And thank you again for being on the Dino Talks here. And we look forward to seeing each other very soon somewhere. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
We believe by rewarding climate solutions and warning all the polluters, we will make it profitable to save our planet and super expensive to destroy it.
We must now zoom in on the quality and the implementation of plans, on measuring and analyzing, on reporting, transparency and accountability.
We want to be better, and that's why we are open for climate dialogue.
We want to know what you think, and so that we can improve.
Let's give climate love to those that have the solutions. And let's send climate warning to those that needs to change.
I invested in We Don't Have Time because I actually agree, we don't have time.
We're trying to reduce CO2 collectively.
If we don't act urgently and quickly, catching up later won't work.
The drive to net zero is the growth story of the 21st century.
We had about $350 billion of direct subsidies and tax expenditures, tax breaks given to fossil fuels.
Have such an enormous mobilization of business, finance, civil society, and science all gathered here.
We have halved our own emissions between 2012 and 2017 and are now at the 70% reduction.
SSAB has decided to be the first steel company in the world to offer fossil-free steel to the market in just a few years.
There's lack of clarity and it feeds greenwashing and delays meaningful action.
We just have to go quickly. We have the technology. We don't have to develop technology.
We're going to create this huge wealth transfer from energy producers, who represent a tiny minority of people, to energy consumers, who represent all people.
We are in a climate emergency, and we are very far from where we need to be.
Get ahead of the curve or you're going to lose.
I was able to attend one demonstration that kicked off at Kelvin Grove all the way to George Square, and we had a lot of activists.
What I feel that I can bring is a young audience that maybe doesn't know what to think about climate change.
What is happening here, negotiating, it's so wrong from our perspective. You don't put a price on your mother.
Now, personally, I don't believe the fossil fuel industry should continue to be allowed to operate the way it's been operating for the last several decades.
We want to bring a voice to all the new solutions, the new ideas, the new entrepreneurs who are out there trying to kind of make a break and create this new climate economy.
They're setting a great example, and there's lots of other big businesses that should follow their example.
I really want to urge everybody just to be thinking more about land use and not just electrifying vehicles to, maintain the environment that got us here today.
They want to ban the word burgers, sausages, and steaks from being used on vegan and vegetarian products.
Tell them what they do so that they will be encouraged to do more. And together with the community or users, we share this to millions of people on social media, so this is getting noticed.
Let's bring in Shweta Chakrabarty tonight, risk and behavioral scientist and president of U.S. operations for We Don't Have Time.
As the name says, we don't have time.
ستوكهولم مؤسس منظمة ليس لدينا الوقت. We don't have time. السيد إنغمار رونسبورغ.
Joining us for more is We Don't Have Time's Nick Nuttall. Nick, welcome to the program.
And Nick, about this counter, speaking of numbers.
This is a clock that shows you how much money has been spent on fossil fuel subsidies since the beginning of the COP.
We have a climate crisis and we're still subsidizing the industry which is causing the crisis. I mean, it's completely dumb. I'm a finance guy, it makes no sense whatsoever.
$2.5 trillion went into subsidies for fossil fuel. That's a definition of insanity.
Still, this is a positive. It's the first COP decision that actually mentions coal power or fossil fuel subsidies.
We need to communicate climate action. Because if only a few people or a few companies are doing climate action without communicating it to others, we will not solve the climate crisis.